sermon series on Esther. We're looking at chapter 5, the full chapter 5. So read about Esther, yay, and her confrontation with Haman, boo, as it comes out through Esther chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And then when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." And the king said, "Bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." And Haman went out that day, joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath at Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, and all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I will be invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife and Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made.
Thanks, Calvin. It's funny that he brought up boo, because I was having a conversation with someone the other day. I was like, what is the culturally appropriate way to express, discontent in ancient Jewish culture? Because I was thinking, like, my dad wouldn't go boo. My dad would probably just go like, so I don't know, maybe that's a little more appropriate. So we're moving on in our sermon series in Esther, and we left off last week with a bit of a cliffhanger. So last week, our main protagonist, which is, of course, Esther, decided to risk her life. She decided to risk her life and to go before the king to ask for the king's favor so that the Jewish people may be saved. I mentioned last week, right, that in Persian culture, this was not allowed, right? Only a certain number of people were allowed to go before the king without being requested or without being summoned. And Esther, even though she was the queen, was not one of those people that can just go up to the king and express her requests. And so by going before the king uninvited, it could really mean death for her, as this could have been an opportunity, right, for the king just to get rid of Esther and find a new queen. Well, as we see in the beginning of chapter 5, this tension is quickly resolved, right? Right away, we see the king reach out his scepter, and Esther is able to go up and approach the king and hopefully to make her request. But as we'll see in this chapter, right? Hopefully, as we'll see, like she's actually not in the clear, right? Even though she got past that first hurdle of being able to approach the king and she's still alive, right? As we'll see, this situation is pretty complicated, and it's going to be really require a miracle for the king to grant her request, and for the Jewish people to be saved. And so, as we look at this chapter, as a whole, what we find, I think, as I look at it, is we find two different people. All right, we find Esther on the one hand, and we see Haman on the other. And both Esther and Haman are looking for the king's favor. Right, and because in this chapter, both Esther and Haman are looking for the favor of the king, I think this chapter invites us to compare Esther and Haman. Right, both of them want the approval of the king. Right, but as we'll see, they do it for two very different reasons, right, and two very different motivations. And as we talk about this, I think it'll be interesting for us, right, to see who is it that we look to for approval, right? What does it mean for us? What is our motivations? What are our intentions behind the way that we seek the approval of others? And in many ways, we're talking about this very basic human need, right? The need for approval, the need to be validated, the need to really feel like, that I am accepted and loved. And so as we go through this text, just three things I think that's important for us to see. One, I think everyone needs approval from others, or at least everyone has the desire to want to be approved by others. Second, this need for approval can turn us into really dreadful people. And third, how does God address this need that we have for approval? All right, so first, as we're going to see, everyone kind of needs this approval from others. And first, we see it in Esther. And as you look at the beginning of this chapter, notice the kind of the regality, the splendor, the dignity of this whole situation. Because take a look at what Esther is doing. Right, it says in verse 1, right, it says, "On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courts of the king's palace in the front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace." And so if you notice here, you just kind of, you can imagine the royalty of this, right? Esther's putting on her official, royal getup, and the king is sitting in his palace, sitting on his throne, and you just kind of see how Esther is really going out of her way to make sure that she looks like a dignified and queen as she approaches King Xerxes or King Ahasuerus. And so then in verse 2 it says, "And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, and the king said to her, 'What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you even to half of my kingdom.' And Esther said, 'If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king.' Now, when the king says, 'It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom,' this isn't meant to be taken literally. He wasn't about to give up half his kingdom to Queen Esther. This was simply a phrase that people used to say, 'Hey, I'm feeling really generous. What do you want? I'll give it to you.' Even you move forward in the New Testament, this is what King Herod did this as well. He said to his daughter, 'Hey, what do you want? I'll give you half my kingdom.' If you remember, she asked for John the Baptist's head, and he gave it to her. But this phrase, 'I'll give you half my kingdom,' simply just means that what is it that you want? I'm willing to give it to you. Now, if you notice, Queen Esther is kind of slow playing this entire situation, and we're tempted to ask, why didn't Esther just make her request right then and there? Right, because it seems like she got past the hard part, right? She wasn't going to be put to death, and that's good. And so why didn't she just make her request when the king asked her? Now, there's a couple of reasons why, and commentators kind of think through, what makes the situation still very difficult for the king? And if you think about it, right, first, Esther is asking for the reversal of a law that he made. Right, and back then in Persia, we know that when they have this rule that when a law is made, it can't be overturned, not even by the king. Right, so even the king can't overrule the law. Even the king is not above the law. And so there's still that little complication that needs to be sorted out, and we'll see that as we go forward. Secondly, this request was made by the king's signet ring. Right, this was his ring that was on this decree to kill all the Jews. And so he, in many ways, could be losing face by trying to go back on a commandment that he has already made. Third, if King Xerxes was to make this request, it would cost the king about 10,000 talents, right? Because that's the amount Haman promised him, and so that's a lot of money. And fourth, by revealing her Jewish identity, right? By revealing her Jewish identity, she might experience some backlash from her husband, right? Because in many ways, she's been deceiving her husband for many years. And so as you can see, there's actually quite a few obstacles, and the situation is still quite complicated. And it's interesting as we go through to see how Esther is going to navigate these political waters, to be able to save the Jewish people, right? So in many ways, it would still require, right, nothing short of a miracle for the Jewish people to be saved, right? So what Queen Esther does is says, "Hey, come to this meal that I have prepared, this feast that I've prepared. You and Haman come." And after dinner, the king must have realized, that Esther didn't just risk her life just to have a date with him, and so once again, after dinner, he asks again, right, "What is your request?" And this is what we see in verse 6, right? And it says, and as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted to you, and what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king said." And so once again, it's interesting, right? Because this is not a bad time to ask him. The wine is flowing, the food is served, the king is happy, he's fed, he's in a good mood, he's feeling generous, right? And in many ways, he asks her again, "What is it that you want? Why am I enjoying this feast?" And once again, we're kind of left off with this cliffhanger. And the way that the author writes the text, it almost looks like she's about to say it, right? It's like, "My wish and my request is for you to come back tomorrow, and we'll have another feast." And so, right, so she's very you kind of see just how politically savvy she was, right? She's kind of building up this tension, building up this anticipation. And kind of the idea, as we're going to see this moving forward, is that she's trying to get the king to a place where he has no choice but to accept her request and say yes to her request, right? But once again, we're left with this cliffhanger, and actually, this is not going to get resolved for another 2 weeks, because next week there's a big twist in the story, and we're going to get to that next week. And then actually, I think Tim is going to preach the resolution to what happens the next day. And so, as we kind of look at this chapter, right, as Esther's kind of slow playing this situation, what do we make of what Esther is doing here? On the one hand, I wasn't sure if I should say this, but on the one hand, I think there could be actually an application to be made about how God has called us to be wise and savvy in our everyday dealings. It's kind of a weird application, but I think in some ways it applies, because so I thought of, for example, Matthew 10:16. Right, where Jesus says, "Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." Right, or if you think of Luke chapter 16, this is probably I would say it's the most difficult parable that Jesus ever told. And this is the one about the master who is commending his dishonest servant. And in Luke 16, right, it says, "And the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness." Right, and basically, in that parable, the manager, knowing that he would get fired, he decided to use the master's wealth to gain an advantage for himself. And kind of the twist of the parable is that he actually gets commended for what he did. Now, this is kind of a difficult thing to apply generally. In fact, I think this would be a fascinating discussion, to have afterwards, or in our small groups, or in second hour, right? If God has called us to kind of be savvy and kind of be wise and kind of be, kind of prudent in our everyday dealings, right? At what point does it kind of cross over into sin, right? At what point does it become, maybe you're being a little too, smart, or it's being too wise in some ways, in our dealings. But I think one clue, just to kind of wrap up this application, I think one clue that we have from this chapter, and as well as Matthew and Luke, is that the motivation, right, the reason why they're trying to be savvy is not for their own benefit, right? It's not so that they themselves can benefit from it, right? Both in Matthew and Luke, it's talking about being savvy in the world so that people would know Christ, right? To kind of read the room, read the world, read the situation, be savvy in the way that people come to know Christ. And of course, Esther is doing it in a way to save God's people, right? She herself is taking a huge risk by going before the king. And so in many ways, we're going to have to figure out, in our everyday life, whether we're crossed the line and we're sinning or we're being wise. But I think one of the biggest check to our motivation, right, is to think, are we doing it, right? Are we being savvy for our own selfish gain, right? Or is it for the benefit of others? But either way, I think this is kind of an interesting application here, as we see Esther kind of navigating these, tough political waters of her time. So that's one application. But I think another application that could be made here, and really this is the rest of the sermon, right, is how can we seek the approval of others without it becoming an idol for us? Right, because in this chapter we see Esther going way out of her way, right? Makeup, with dress, with talk, with everything that she's doing, she's trying to seek the approval of the king. And I think one of the questions we have to wrestle here is, how is it that she is able to so desperately seek the approval of the king, right, without it becoming an idol, without it controlling her, right, without her being like, what the king thinks of me is my everything, what the king thinks of me is my identity and my purpose, right? How is it that we can seek the approval of others, want the approval of others, right, without being controlled by what others think of us? And so a couple weeks ago, I showed you guys this chart, and we were talking about power 2 weeks ago, which is why, that first line. And so the second line of this chart, which I found interesting, there's actually 2 more lines to this chart. We'll see if Esther leads us there. But what's interesting, right, is that what this chart is talking about is if you seek approval, what it says is that your greatest nightmare will be, of course, rejection, right? If you seek the approval of others, of course, your greatest nightmare will be rejection. But then it says that if your idol is approval, then people around you will often feel smothered. And this is true because, since you care so much about what others think of you, you're constantly checking in, right, to make sure that, make sure this person still likes me, or make sure my relationship is still okay. Or even like if you do this tiny little thing, and like afterwards you're kind of thinking in your head, like, did that person take it the wrong way? Like, hopefully that person took it the way that I wanted them to take it. And then, you have to like make sure, like, hey, when I said this, I just want to make sure that, you didn't take it wrongly. Now, it's not like it's wrong to do that, right? But it's kind of a check, right? It's kind of a, mental way for us to think about, is the approval of others one of the idols that we have? Right now, of course, the problem emotion is cowardice, right? You're unable to be brave, too scared to offend if seeking the approval of others. And what's interesting is that, even though Esther was desperately hoping for the approval of the king, we really don't see any of these things in Esther, right? She's not afraid of rejection, right? We saw in the end of the last chapter, Esther said, if I perish, then I perish, but I'm still going to go before the king. And secondly, well, I guess the king might have felt a little bit smothered by, all the feasts that she's hosting, but right, it's clearly not because of a emotional need that Esther has, right? She's doing it for a specific purpose because she wants to save God's people. And certainly, Esther is no coward at all, right? What she's doing here is extremely brave. Right, so the question is, how is it that she's able to want the king's favor without it becoming an idol for her? And I think the answer here is, of course, right, that she has first and foremost found her identity in God. Right, the answer is, of course, that specifically her identity in God has now risen to the very top of her life. And so let me, explain it this way. So many of us here, we would probably say that we're Christian. Right? Maybe most of us would say, yes, I'm a Christian. Like, being a Christian is part of my identity, right? That's who I am. That's part of who I am. But why is it, right, that Christians can still be jealous and envious and prideful and boastful and full of malice, right? Why is it that Christians can, do some terrible things, say some terrible things, and, why is that? And I think the reason is because at that moment, while your Christian identity is still a part of your life, right, it hasn't risen to the top, right, at the very top of your life, because something else is there. All right, so for example, if God's not at the very top of your life, maybe you say things like, man, what good is God if I can't get the job that I want? Or what good is God if I can't get into the school or the program that I'm looking to? Or what good is God if I can't find a spouse? Or what good is God if, my business is failing? Right? What good is God if all these problems in my life haven't gone away? Right? It's not that you aren't a Christian, right? But I think it's at that moment God is not at the very top. There's something else there. And what we see here in Esther, right, is that all her life Esther was, of course, Jewish, right? And all her life Esther just saw herself as Jewish as well. And most of her life until up to this point, right, her Jewish identity was just all the way down over here. But now that she's made this choice, right, to stand with God's people, all of a sudden her Jewish identity has risen to the very top. Right, who she was in God, her trust in God, it rose to the very top. Right, and so it's not that she wasn't Jewish, and it wasn't that she didn't identify with the Jewish people. It's just that all of a sudden her identity as a person, as a daughter of God, has now risen to the very top of her life. And that is why I think here she's able to be brave. Right, that's why she's able to say, you know what, if I perish, then I perish, but I'm going to do this either way. Right, it's because all of a sudden God has now become the primary reality in her life. And I think what that means for us is, when God, when God is at the very top of our lives, or what that means is that you're okay, if you're not the richest or the smartest. You're okay if your kids aren't the most athletic or the most gifted. It's okay if I like other people more than they like me. Right? It's okay if I, sometimes get rejected. Now, it doesn't mean that it feels good to be rejected. Right? But when God is at the very top, what that means is when you get rejected, yes, it's not going to feel good, but it's also not going to just completely devastate you. Right? When God is at the very top and you don't get accepted, yes, you'll be sad. Right? But that doesn't mean that failure is going to define who we are. Right? So if you see what Esther, right, the reason why Esther is able to do what she's doing here is I think the passage is challenging us to think, right, what is at the very top of our lives right now? Right? And do we also need to make the same decision Esther did? Right? To say, God, I want to put you at the very top. Right? I want to trust you with all of my life right now, no matter what I'm going through. Right? I want to trust you with all that I have moving forward. Right? So I think the reason why Esther is able to be so brave, right, is because the only reason why she's able to look for the king's approval without it defining her is because who she is in Christ or who she is in God is now the most important thing in her life. Right? So that's what we get from Esther, right? That's one way where this is one person who is seeking the king's approval. But then the chapter also then invites us to look at Haman, right? Haman is also looking for the king's approval, but look at how Haman does it, and you'll see this as a stark contrast to Esther, right? So this is starting in verse 9, this is after Esther's feast with the king and Haman, and this is Haman going home. So he says, "And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh." Verse 11, "And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, and the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. And Haman said, 'Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow I'm also invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so as long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate.'" What is, I'm sure, pretty obvious to you, right, is that Haman's whole world, kind of revolved around his extremely fragile ego that he had. And here's how you can tell, I think, right, when your need for approval has crossed the line. It's when, it's not good enough that Haman's in this really high position. Right, it's not good enough that he got to eat with the king and the queen. But notice what Haman does here. He only feels good when he compares himself with others around him. Right, you see this in this text, right? Notice when he recounts these events to his friends and family, he says he's now higher than the other officials of the king. Right, and then he says, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but me." right? Come to eat with the king and the queen, right? Not only is it all about him, but more specifically, it's about how he compares with the other people around him. Right? I think this is why he gets so angry with Mordecai. Right? How is it that there's this one person who won't respect me and won't bow down to me, who isn't afraid of me? Right? And his ego just cannot let that go. Right? Even though he's on the top of his career, eating with the king and queen, little old Mordecai sitting at the king's gate makes him just so angry that this one person won't bow down to me. Right? And I think this is where our desire for approval can get, off the rails. Right? It's that it's not just good enough that you're successful, but it's that you're more successful than the people around you. Right? It's not good enough that you're rich, right? But you have to be wealthier than your neighbor. It's not good enough that your kid is athletic, right? They have to be more athletic than their peers. Or, Haman's entire identity, was built not just on how good he was at something, right? But on how good he was at something in comparison to others. And this kind of reminds me of when I was in high school. I was a little bit delusional because I wanted to go into singing full time. I was a little bit crazy back then. I don't know why I thought that. But at one point in my high school years, I was in choir for like 12 years of my life. I was in choir since kindergarten, and I was voted the best singer in my high school, which basically just a popularity contest, and there was no one else in the running with me. But I was feeling pretty good about myself. I'm like, yeah, I'm a pretty good singer, like I've been doing this for a while, and it was part of my identity as a decent singer. I'm like, hey, maybe I'll do this full time. I seem okay at it, and so it turns out, I was just a really big fish in a really small pond. Because once I wandered out into the world of professional singing, I realized that, oh man, I don't got what it takes to make it in this world. And in many ways, I struggled with my identity as a singer, right? Especially when I realized how everyone around me was just, so much better than I was. Right, and I think in some ways you can make this case here as well, right? The fact that often, right, almost always we get our identity from the people around us. But I also want to argue, that it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because I think this is actually the way that God has created us to be. Right, that God actually creates us for us to get our identity from someone outside of us. And for example, right, all throughout the Bible, you see this idea of naming, right, where God gives people their identity, right? And you see that when God names people, right? So for example, when God renames Abram to Abraham, when God renames Jacob to Israel, right, what is God doing? God is giving them an identity, right, that is outside of themselves. He's saying, this is now your identity, right? And all throughout the Bible, right, we see parents naming their kids, right, with a very specific definition in mind. And what are you doing? You're saying, kid, right, I'm giving you this name because this is what I want you to embody. In many ways, they're giving them their identity outside of themselves. Right, and what's going on here is right, people are getting their identity, and our culture wants to tell us, in our modern culture, we want to tell us who you are comes from deep within you, right? You have to look inside you. You have to be true to yourself. You have to do you. You can't let other people tell you who you are, right? But I think the great tension with that is that who we are is always influenced, right, by the people around us. And I would argue, that this is actually the way that God has created us. And we see in Haman, right, that this can result in some pretty bad pitfalls. Right? We see in Haman this can lead to a lot of despair if our identity is crushed, or a lot of grief, right, because we care a lot about what others think of us. Right? But even though sin can twist this desire into something negative, what I want to argue is that there's actually a really positive side to this as well. And so if I can give you an example. And so, when I was a kid, I think I was pretty immature. And when I say kid, I mean college, young adults. I don't know if I'm old enough to call them kids, but so back when I was around that age, I would consider myself, pretty immature. And it's embarrassing looking back at my high school years because I think everyone else knew that I was really insecure about myself, and I feel like just flowed out of me, even though I tried to exude, confidence. But I feel like people just saw through me. And I remember, college, young adult age, I was very unsure of myself, I had a lot of insecurities, and, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do after college. I wasn't, even after seminary, right, I wasn't sure if I was, cut out for ministry or, if this is, what God wants me to do. And, what really changed my life, right, was when someone that I respected, sat me down and said, hey, Wayne, have you considered doing this, right, because I think you'll be really good at it. right? When I was in college, I met up with my mentor. He's like, "Hey, have you considered seminary? Because I think you're really raw. You got a lot to improve on, but I think this is something that you'll be really good at." And when the person sat me down, when my mentor sat me down and said that to me, it completely changed my life. It completely, redefined, how I thought of myself. Right? He was just thinking, from my perspective, right? I think this is something that you'll excel at. And that completely changed my life when someone that I respected, would look at me and said, "Hey, Wayne, have you considered, doing this?" Or, the way that Tim Keller said this in a sermon is that he says, "To have the esteem of someone you esteem is self-esteem." Or to have the esteem of someone you esteem is self-esteem. Right? To have someone you respect speak into your life. Right? That can change everything. To give you another example, so back in college, they required everyone to take this public speaking class, and the one class that everybody hated. I don't know if college students. I don't know if you guys still are required to take a public speaking class today, but this is one just those gen eds that everybody had to take, and everyone hated it. And multiple times a semester, right? You have to write a speech, you have to go up, and you have to do it, and everyone just hated this class. Now, to be honest, I think I still need to improve in my public speaking. But despite, even though I spend a lot of time doing, this, I think there's still a lot I need to improve on. But I remember in that class, right, after I gave my speech, my teacher said, I can see you being something like a administrator, right, or someone who stands up and leads meetings. And as a shy college student, I was like, what? I don't think my speech was that great, but, and it was a non-Christian setting, right? She wasn't going to be like, "Oh, I think you'll make a good pastor." But the fact that someone else, right, looked at me and said, "Hey, I think you're a pretty good speaker. I think you have, what it takes if you practice it a little bit more, and I think you'll be, a good speaker." And I remember back in college, that was a huge encouragement in my life, right, for someone to speak that into me. And the reason why I'm saying this is because, who we are, right, is always going to be defined by those around us. Right? And yes, there's tragic pitfalls, right? This can lead us into really bad places, but it's actually also an opportunity for each one of us, right, to be that person who deeply encourages somebody else. Right? It's an opportunity for each one of us to speak truth and encouragement into someone else's life. Right? Because I think most of the time, right, I do marriage counseling, and one of the chapters is about how both wife and husband are really insecure, right? All of us have these insecurities, and oftentimes we don't realize what we're good at or what we're bad at or things that we're good at. And you always think of people like, "Oh, yeah, that person's really good at that. They must know that, because why wouldn't they know that, right? They're really good at it." But I think oftentimes people don't, right? People really don't know, what you're thinking in your mind. And so in many ways, I think, not to stroke each other's egos, right? But I think we can really be that kind of encouragement and kind of that supportive force, right, for another person, right, by speaking this kind of truth and this encouragement into each other's lives. But yet, despite, needing to find our identity, right, based on the people around us, the truth is, if we only rely on people, right, if we only rely on people, it's not necessarily going to give us the security that we need, right? Because I'm sure, as all of us have experienced, many times people will fail us, right? Our friends and mentors and parents, right? They may not be there when we need them the most, right? When we're really struggling, we might not have people there to speak truth into our lives. And maybe like Esther, you're finding yourself to be all by yourself in the king's palace, right? With no support, with nobody around you, right? No one to speak encouragement to you. But as we see in this chapter, right, when she decided to make her Jewish identity the highest defining identity of her life, right, what she found was a God who never left her or forsake her. Right, what she found was a God who was always with her, despite her compromising, despite her hiding her Jewish identity. She found a God, right, who was loving and gracious, abounding in steadfast love. Right, and so if you think about it this way, right, when she approached King Xerxes, right, or King Ahasuerus, she was really scared. Right? She was frightened. She was anxious. She was trying to figure out what kind of mood is the king in. Right? She was cautious. She was kind of slow playing this whole situation. Didn't want to, tell him about her real request right away. Right? That was Esther's relationship with the king. But when she placed her faith in God, I think what she must have realized is that she now has the favor of an even greater king. Or when she placed her faith in God, she must have realized that now I have the favor of the King of Kings. Right now I have the favor of the King who's above all kings. Now I have the favor of the name who is above all names. Right? And in many ways, right, our relationship with God, right, is nothing like Esther's relationship with Xerxes. Right? Because God invites us to come to him. Right? When he describes it in the New Testament, Jesus describes it more like a child running into the arms of their parents. Right? In the book of Hebrews, God welcomes us to approach his throne with confidence. Right? Approach his throne with confidence that we can go before the King because we know that we'll receive mercy and grace. Right? And we're confident not because, that we're so great. We're confident not because, this week we've been a really good Christian. We come not because, we feel really good about ourselves, but we come because our record has been made clean, right, by the blood of Christ. Right? Our confidence as we approach God is only because of Jesus' death on the cross and that he has made us clean before God. You see, when you know, right, when you know in deep down in your heart, when God has risen to the top of your life, when you know that you have the approval of the King of Kings, right, when you know that you have the approval of the name that's above all names, then that is what is going to change your life. Right, yes, we're still going to need one another. Right, yes, we're still going to experience disappointment and grief. But when the approval and love of God has risen to the very top of your life, I think that's the only way when you'll no longer be controlled and defined by what other people think of you. Right? And that is the freedom that we have in Christ. All right, the freedom that because we know we have the approval of God, right, that it allows us to not be controlled by those around us. Yes, we're still going to need one another. We're still going to need to speak truth into our lives, but at the very core, we know that we are loved and accepted by God. And so let's allow this truth, really just sink deep into our hearts. And as a result, let's also be able to go out and be an encouragement to one another. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for this amazing book of Esther. We thank you for the opportunity to study your word in public and be able to consider together what Esther had to go through. And even though she lived, thousands of years ago, in many ways, the human heart, the human condition of sin, and your grace is never changing across every single generation. For you are God, the Creator. You're the God who made us. And you have created in us this desire, this want to be approved, this want to be loved, this want to be accepted, this want to be validated. And you've created that in us, but you've created it for us to find that ultimate fulfillment in you. So, Father, I pray that as a community of believers, as a community of people who are willing to follow you, that want to follow you, that you have changed our hearts. Father, I pray that each one of us would know from the bottom of our soul that we are loved and accepted by you, so that we can then go out and be a huge encouragement to one another. Father, sink these truths deep down